And we are live.
All right, I'm going to call to order the initial meeting of the City Hall Building Ad Hoc Committee. It is Tuesday, May 12th, 4:18 p.m. With us, myself, Adam Yoder, Chair of the Ad Hoc Committee, council members Liz Mealy and Vince Polizzi. Additionally, we have Bonnie Katz, Randy Allison, and Janice Frank from City Council. From the administration, we have Mayor Derek Slaughter, we have Joe Girardi, Joe Pavlak, members of the ad hoc committee, Chris Cooley, Chief Hagan have joined us as well. And I think I caught everybody. I'm sorry, John Mackey from City Council is with us as well. So I sent an agenda out for the committee. Hope everybody was able to take a look at it and review it quick. And I'll just to kick this off, just to kind of talk about what our scope is here as we go into the agenda. We formed the City Council from President Allison formed the ad hoc committee with the goal of exploring all of our options as far as where the long-term home of City Hall is going to be. I think we've looked at a number of different things related to City Hall in the past, and and before making a final decision on where the long-term home of City Hall is going to be, there's some additional things that I think the committee wants to validate with not only what's happened previously with studies with City Hall, but in addition, look at a couple of other options that have not been looked at before to ensure we're being prudent in the long-term move. And so the end result of the committee being a formal recommendation for City Council in where the long-term home of city government will be, whether it's staying in City Hall and getting it to where it needs to be from a number of infrastructure items, or executing one of the other options that the committee will review. And moving into the second item of the agenda, to kind of point out the options that the committee is going to explore. Obviously, we're going to go through and do our diligence one last time with the current status and what it would take to stay in City Hall as is long term. There's been a number of obviously studies that have been discussed publicly and what have you. We're going to rehash those, make sure they're still valid, see if there are any additional gaps of things that would need to happen to get City Hall up to par to where it would need to be. And as a part of that, not only from a renovation perspective, but I think a space utilization perspective. And looking at other options, from talking with members of City Council as well as the members of the committee here, outside of Mayor Slaughter, we haven't been able to connect. Sorry about that. There seems to be a general consensus on the other two options, excuse me, of what we need to explore to ensure we're making the most prudent decision. These other options would be moving into Trade and Transit 1 or Trade and Transit 2. And I think the big thing that we need to understand would be, number one, are we able to legally, based on how they were funded from being built, but also what are the costs associated with that? Not only moving into them, but are there modifications, changes, or any other items in line with that that would need to happen as a part of that? The third option that has not been explored, that will take a bit more time, but I think, and from talking with the group here, seems to be prudent, is to look at procuring and moving into a non-city owned building, whether that is, and that's to be determined. There are plenty of real estate options in the city, and looking at the feasibility from a fiscal and timeliness perspective of that is certainly a part of that. So, and I think from talking with the group here, and then I'll stop and just make sure that there's no other additional comments in relation to the options being explored. There's been a lot of talk in the past leading up to this point of a public safety building in combination with the county. I think as we, as a group, look at options 2 and 3, trade and transit 1 and 2, as well as moving into a non-city owned building, I think looking at that opportunity and quantifying what that looks like and how that would impact the city is certainly going to be a big aspect of both of those options. So, like I said, from talking with members of the committee, members of the administration, members of council, that seems to be the general consensus of the options that this ad hoc committee should look at. Any comments from the members of the committee or any feedback thus far on the options being explored? Perfect. Moving into item 3, from talking with a number of the members of the administration on the committee, as well as members of council, in an effort to not only be timely, but I think leverage the depth of experience that is a part of the committee and a part of the administration, I thought a good idea would be to not split up tasks necessarily, but make sure that there was a point person for each option between council and the administration. And so I took the liberty of making a first stab at putting together what I would call team assignments. So like I had mentioned, there's 3 options with City Hall, or that we're reviewing: City Hall, Trade and Transit 1 and 2, or moving into a non-city owned facility. What I had initially come up with was myself and John Sander being the primary points of contact or what have you for the renovation of City Hall. I think that with our experience and background in facilities and engineering, we can not only, I think, validate what makes the most sense of the information that we currently have, but identify any potential scope gaps that might be hanging out there, and do that relatively quickly. With Trade and Transit 1 and 2, I wanted to propose to the committee that we would have Councilwoman Liz Mealy, Finance Director Joe Pavlock, and Norm Lubin take the initial lead on investigating trade and transit options 1 and 2, mainly for a couple of reasons. I think those are more historical in nature. I think with Councilwoman Mealy's experience, with Joe Pavlock's experience, and the legal aspect that hangs in there, I think that that's a good group to initially take the lead on that. And then with the option for a non-city owned facility, I was thinking Councilman Palizzi and Joe Girardi, with Councilman Palizzi's development experience, as well as Joe's knowledge of the city and codes as far as what would need to happen as far as getting that up to speed. I thought that was a good group to take the point. Obviously, the goal here, again, is not to delegate work and direct work. I do think, though, from a timeliness perspective, having point people on this would make a lot of sense. And from talking with members of council and members of the administration, I think we all very much see this as a collaborative effort here. I think that we're all going to be jumping in and supporting each of these individual teams and groups as are needed. So those are some initial thoughts as far as how to approach this and how to tackle the challenge in front of us. And the last comment before just any comments or thoughts from the committee here. I, at least personally, am really envisioning our city engineer, John Sander, to be pretty heavily involved in this specifically. I think his expertise is going to really be needed and leveraged across all 3, from space utilization, the engineering aspect of this. So, just some initial thoughts on how we go about tackling the challenge in front of us. Any comments, questions, or feedback from the committee? Mayor Slaughter, I didn't list you on here specifically. Again, obviously, I think you're going to be involved with all of these, but I know, given the circumstances, there's a lot going on in your office specifically. So I was trying to keep that in the back of my mind as far as trying to identify point people. So FYI. Any thoughts or comments from the group?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very well laid out plan. I was kind of curious. Well, I don't have the printout of the time frame. We're looking at about a year-ish to get a final decision before city council. Is that correct, Adam?
So
It's the only printout I don't have in front of me.
no, that's okay. If there, I'll defer to the group for any other comments or questions because that's the next item on the agenda.
Yeah, we got it up here now.
You know, as you and I had discussed, Adam, the other day in conversation, I do think it's important that we bear in mind that I don't know that within city government we're capable of taking on this task in a way that will succeed in convincing all of us that we've thoroughly explored the issue. So the one thing I think that we want to bear in mind is that we should start out doing exploration and gathering background documentation with an idea, with an eye toward figuring out whether it's something we can do in-house or whether it's something that we should be looking for to potentially, you know, hire a consultant to help us establish. With, you know, I would say, of course, Mr. Sander is the point person because he's the guy who's got some experience with feasibility studies in his back pocket already. That would be my only observation, is that we have tried a handful of times and failed to do this well in-house. And the one very specific element that we've never really taken on is calculating the cost and what it looks like both time-wise and time-wise, expense-wise, and just kind of organizationally to move City Hall somewhere else. You know, so
yeah, understood.
Kind of a thinking outside the box sort of thing that we might be wise to have more heads involved in than just ours.
Yeah, no, understood. And I was planning to bring both of those up in the next items on the agenda for both schedule of work as well as additional resources needed. So
Okay.
duly noted.
Mm-hmm.
Chief, you had your hand up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. As some of you are aware, I started this public safety building ad hoc committee. We've had a number of meetings. Mr. Girardi has done some preliminary drawings of the facility. We presented that to some of you in October of last year. It's gone as far with that process as a draft MOU that has been sent to Mr. McDermott at the county and is going to be presented over there. The idea being, when we get an MOU with both the county and the other agency involved, that we can then actually form a formal committee and start looking at costs and how we're gonna go about getting an architect and things like that, if we're gonna take it that far. So the plan was to bring that before council in the near future, if the county has it before the commissioners and also the other group. So we went quite far with that process, but in doing that, we obviously took a look at what had been done by Dave Young and the rest of the administration previously, and we ran across a Homeland security study of the security of this building. Notwithstanding all the other issues that have been brought up about all of the problems with the building and its age and things like that, my primary concern is that the building itself is not set up for government operations of the modern day. From a security standpoint, I don't know if there's enough renovation that would make this a safe place for us to run a government. So I would be willing, or if you don't have copies, some of you may, I certainly have a copy of the Homeland Security Assessment of City Hall, and I'll get that to you right away. I would ask that you read that and take that into account, along with all the cost issues. I'm not saying that we have to move, but if to stay would be, in my opinion, I think this was a hasty decision in 1979 when they moved here. And I've said this many times, but in 1970, when they needed a new courthouse, they built one. In 1976, when they needed a new federal building, they built one. But in 1979, when we needed a new city hall, we moved in here, and it probably wasn't a good decision then. And so, anyway, that's all I had.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, Chief, I appreciate that. So the public safety building option very much comes into play as we look at this. So I think my assumption is, without seeing it, there's a lot of work that's already been done that will be extremely helpful as we work to quantify what the best option overall is. So that would be very helpful. Thank you very much. And that's a big part of it for all three options. So I would agree. If you guys want to look at the preliminary schedule of work here, so kind of tying into the comment that Councilwoman Mealy made, I put together an initial just first pass, very high level schedule for each individual option, with some pretty basic stuff as far as what we need to do in my mind. And this is obviously open for discussion here. Councilwoman Mealy, to your point, if you look at it specifically at the first couple of options with City Hall, as well as Trade and Transit 1 or 2, a lot of, in my mind, the initial work of this committee is going to be gathering a lot of that historical documentation and information that we need to start driving and making the proper decision. So Chief Hagan, as you just referenced, that security study that has been done in the past, that is a very applicable document, not only for looking at the current City Hall option, but Trade and Transit 1 and 2, because the same thing likely would need to happen if we would move into TT 1 and 2 versus staying in City Hall or moving into a brand new building. And also, if we would build or purchase a new building, we would need to know that information as well. So I think, in my mind, initially, and by all means, please offer some thoughts, feedback, additional insights. I think initially here, there's a lot of information gathering and documentation gathering as far as what's out there, what can we find, and where are the gaps. And Councilwoman Mealy, to your point, as we identify what gaps are outstanding from a scope perspective to make a properly informed decision, we may at that point identify we need to bring other people outside of city government into the table, likely more for the second and third options. So the other thing that I forgot to mention as I look down through the scope of work, I think a big thing that we would be wise to look at, and that I am hopeful that we can look at, is what kind of other funding mechanisms are out there for each of these individual options, as far as their federal, state grant money that's out there that could be leveraged to help do these. Are there grant monies out there to help with funding studies of any potential gaps that we find? And I'll be the first one to admit as well, this is a very aggressive and opportunistic or optimistic schedule here. So I think the first two options we can start down the path relatively quickly. The non-city owned building schedule is, I think, going to take the longest and is the most unknown. So comments, thoughts, feedback on timeline, schedule, what have you.
I think really what we need to establish, I mean, and you have it next up, but that that it's a process that might be best begun, and then we can reevaluate the timeline and the schedule. That is to say, as we discussed already, I think if we were to hire a consultant of some sort, that clearly pushes the timeline out somewhat past the timeline that you've currently got.
Yep.
And, you know, and the timeline is aggressive one way or the other, but I think trying to get, you know, the basics established, what we're looking for by the next meeting, by the meeting thereafter, helps us get a bit better of a handle on exactly how realistic that timeline is. You know, in a month's time or something, we might have a better idea.
Yep.
But to me, the current timeline doesn't look impossible. It is a lot of information, and to delve into it thoroughly is going to take a lot of time. And I think frankly, it'll likely take more than 2 people per working group, you know. But I think a 2-person working group moves pretty quickly and efficiently, and potentially can actually gather in person, which makes life a lot easier. So,
Yep.
So we'll give it a try.
Yep.
Yeah. But those would be my observations.
Yeah, no, understood. You know, I would agree. There's a lot of initial documentation gathering, just investigation as far as what's out there, what do we know, and what do we don't know. And you know, like I said, it's an initial aggressive timeline, but taking the first few weeks between now and our next meeting, I think, to start that process and knock out as much of that process as we can, I think is not only feasible, but lines up for the most part initially with this timeline. So I would agree. The other thing, specifically with grant funding, I don't know what the committee's thoughts are here, but at least personally think it would be wise for us to leverage the resources that we have to identify what potential programs, grants may be out there at the federal, state level. I think they could potentially do that rather quickly. May not really be able to quantify how much could be obtained, but at least identify what's out there, what could be done, would we go about you know, getting it, that kind of stuff. So it seems to me like it may be a good idea to, at least initially in this first month or so, bring Penn Strategies and Delta to the table to start navigating that. What are the committee's thoughts? Joe, you're muted if you're trying to talk.
No, what I would say is I do agree. I think bringing them in to find funding to help us with this, it would be a great asset.
Okay. Derek, is that something we can talk offline more about that specifically, but is that something we can potentially get moving on?
It's an avenue we can explore, you know, offline here and take a look at.
Perfect. That's awesome. Liz, Joe, as the, I guess, lead people for TT 1 and 2, as we've talked about the potential need for a third-party consultant as well, I think probably more so for quantifying costs or what have you for the gaps that we identify, is trying to see if and or what money we may be able to find for that, something that I think you two would be willing or able to start the process of over the next, I guess, few weeks as well.
So hang on. So you'd like us to start looking, I mean, as I mentioned, I think a lot of the nitty gritty stuff related to Trade and Transit 2 and our ability to utilize it is probably going to have to get bounced off either Delta or Joel Nagy, because it's so much of the money in there is transit related. But the grant opportunities, it seems to me like looking at grant opportunities is maybe
It's a little bit early for that. I think we need to know what we're doing to explore what grants are available. I mean, we can look to see things that are out there, but
Yeah,
I
I think
think with-
it goes, it's a little bit of a chicken egg argument there, Joe, one way or the other, right? Part of the question is if there are grants available for.
Are
new
we
build
finding a
and
place to
renovation.
fund? Are we
Yeah.
finding a place to work into the grant opportunities that are out there, or are we finding grants to work for what we need to do?
Exactly. And I think unfortunately, it's a little bit of both, right?
Yeah, it is.
Right. That is to say, if we happen to be able to fully fund a renovation of City Hall based on, historical grants, which I know don't exist, but just humor me here for a second, then we probably ought to work out, do the work on City Hall. But, if we instead are finding a bunch of money for, I think the moving into existing city structures is probably the least likely source of grant funding out there. On the other hand, it may be our cheapest option, depending on how that is to say, a new build, a new built city hall or a newly relocated city hall, we might be able to get grants for, but that process then lengthens out to years and years and years.
Joe,
So-
you can jump in here, but my understanding is that Trade and Transit 1 and 2 both had a lot of RACB grants, et cetera, involved in them. And many of them have a time frame that you can't go back to that pot for
Right.
until you've exceeded that time frame. And I don't. know
We
that
need to
looked at
pull
that
the
on either.
original funding sources for Trade and Transit 1. That was done in 99, I believe, or completed in 99. And it was probably pulling funding or finding grant sources for, I would say, probably a 5-year period, at least before that. So there's probably a lot of state and federal funds, potential RACB funds, but it's a matter of digging documents out of the archives to figure out how it was put together, and then possibly looking at the leases that existed with the chamber to see if there's any clues there.
Well, we can certainly start the process.
That's fair.
But I think the whole question of grants is a bit of a chicken and an egg thing. If it would probably behoove us to ask one or both of our consultants what they see on the horizon in case there's money out there that we should be kind of trying to tailor our aims toward. But Joe's right that mostly we probably, until we select a path of action, looking for grants is likely to be a little bit of a needle in a haystack sort of thing, but it wouldn't hurt to at least cast a bit of a wide net and have a look, I suppose. There were references made at the end of last year to the availability of grants for handicapped accessibility.
Mhm.
So if that's part of the if that's part of the goal, we should clearly be looking into the availability of those grants, because those
Yeah.
would presumably would go with whatever project we were moving.
Yeah. No, I would completely agree. I would completely agree. Okay. So we've chatted about grants. We've chatted a little bit about the potential need for a future outside consultant, potentially, depending on what we find or what we find to be missing as far as information, costs associated with that information, that kind of stuff. Before kind of going into the back end of the agenda here, is there any other, I guess, thoughts from the committee as far as, are there any other resources initially that we think we need to, or definitely need to tap into that we haven't already discussed, or that we haven't already thought of so far? Councilwoman Muley, to your point, I think initially, it's going to be an initial set of identifying what information do we have, and what's outstanding. So, okay. Got about 10 minutes left. I want to try to keep these to an hour as we progress through here and tackling the challenge in front of us here. work to conclude this here. Next steps, deliverables for the next committee meeting. As Councilwoman Mealy had said, I think initially a lot of this is going to be investigatory or digging up some of the back history, TT1, TT2, for example. John and I trying to gather up and dive into a lot of the stuff from City Hall. Vince, Joe, I think starting to initially work through, the third option. It seems to me that, so we're meeting June 12th, right? Let me just double check the calendar here. June 9th, I'm sorry. It seems to me that I think from a deliverable perspective or just like a progress update, it would be good to understand what's out there, understand what we have from a information perspective. I'm hearing crickets. What are everybody's thoughts? You're muted, John.
How long are we?
There you go.
How long are we going to be working remotely here? Because if we can't get this to everyone, then it's going to be a problem. So if we can somehow set up like a Dropbox or
We can
something,
set up a Dropbox.
Dropbox to put all these items in, so you guys can independently review them. It would help, right?
That's fine with me. I'm at least familiar with it. I think most of us would be okay. And for those that aren't, I'm happy to try to figure out another medium I can download, organize an email or whatever. So I think that's fine.
As opposed to just sending a million emails, we just start a file structure inside Dropbox and, hey, this has been added. Go ahead and everyone take a look at it,
Yeah. Okay, so we can use the Dropbox medium to share files, share resources, what have you. I think for City Hall specifically, in my mind, it's just documentation, plans, all those studies. John, you're kind of nodding your head. You agree? That's kind of where I'm at. I think the big question. Yeah, exactly. I think the big question with City Hall is that I think so, John. I think you and I can validate what's out there for City Hall and the accuracy of stuff pretty quickly. And I think the other thing for City Hall would be identification of what gaps may still be out there. That might be a bit aggressive, but I think if we can figure that out by the next meeting, or at least make substantial progress in that, I think that's a win. I would say, and again, other people chime in here with what they think is reasonable and legit here. Trade and Transit 1 and 2, I think if we can validate as much as we can, if we're able to actually move in there. And then I don't even know if it's too soon to, John, jump in here and tell me what you think, man. As far as even start to space utilization, you know what I mean?
I was just looking to see if we could physically fit, and then
I
I
think
like we could. So
I think we need to look to make sure we need to see what the funding sources are to find out what restrictions may be in place. There's no point in doing the extra work if we can't move there anyway. So I think pulling some old documents, looking in the archives and determining what's out there, and then consult with potentially Delta or Penn Strategies or the FTA, whoever, to determine whether we have any restrictions. So I think that we need to look at that, and maybe we can start to get an idea of what sources are out there for the next meeting.
Okay.
If I can jump in, I don't see why we can't do that at the same time that we're exploring the options. If we reach out to both Delta and Penn Strategies, give them the 3 options that we're looking to move forward with, so they can begin doing their search while we're doing our work. I think that would be the most effective and efficient use of our time. So we're not one leapfrogging over the other waiting for time. We're not doing our work and then sitting back and waiting for them to do their work. That just seems like a waste of time. If we're trying to meet this timeline that Adam's kind of put together, I think that the best thing is for them to move ahead and begin to look for grant funding sources while we begin to delve into doing the paperwork or doing the research that we need to do.
I think my comments were more related to trade and transit itself. If we can't move in there, there's no point in doing space utilization or
Yeah.
you know, looking for grants to manipulate the facility or do things like that. So I just want to make sure that we're not putting the cart before the horse in that respect. If we find out that it's a go and that we may be able to, or it looks promising that we can move in that direction, I think that at that point we you know, involve others or start to do additional work with there. But I don't want to do too much and invest too much time, or I want to make sure everyone's utilizing their time efficiently.
No, it's a fair point, Joe. And you're right. That is the first question. Can we even go in there? If that's the option, can we even go in there? So I would say if we can get very close to or as close as we can to having an answer for that for the next meeting, I think that would be really good progress. So, okay.
I had one question.
Yeah.
I was talking to John and I were discussing a little earlier today. Are we looking at also one of the options? Are we looking at moving everybody out of City Hall, or are we moving a portion, like all the administration except for the police? Because the way John was looking at the study with Trade and Transit 1, we can actually fit basically, if the spaces are available, which John looked at, that we can fit everybody in there, but maybe the police department. You have the option of possibly, you know, selling City Hall to someone with a lease option for the police to remain, which the amount of renovation work then all of a sudden decreases because it becomes a private owner owning the building, and they can do their renovation work a lot easier than we can do it. So I just wanted to throw that out there. You know, are we, you know, public safety building like Chief Hagan would be the best idea if we could afford to do something like that.
Yeah.
But, you know, do we move a portion of us to a building, leave the police here, and do some minor modifications to the building? That was my.
Yeah, no, understood. I mean, I can defer to the group here before we wrap this up, but it seems to me that that's definitely an option that falls under the number one feasibility and what we can uncover initially with both options number 2 and number 3. And to Chief Hagan's point, there's been some initial work and discussions that have already happened with the county. So not knowing the level of scope and work that has happened already, I can't tell you how far ahead we are on that or what have you, but I would say yes, 100%. There's some initial work I think that needs to happen as far as with Trade and Transit, if we can even go in there, to Joe's point of not putting the cart before the horse, but also I think keeping that in mind as we start to potentially look at what options we would be looking at for purchasing a building in the third option. So I would say yes, but I don't know if we're quite there to answer yes or no. Well, I mean, so okay. As far as the third option, I'll be honest, I'm struggling with this one the most, just because I think it's the most unknown, as well as the one that's going to take the longest to figure out and to even get close to quantifying. In my head, and I'll defer to Vince specifically because he's the developer of the group here. In my head, I initially thought that just seeing what was out there, as far as some feasible options, as far as like what could be procured or what have you, would make sense. But to Joe's point of putting the cart before the horse, I'm not sure if we fully understand how much space we actually need. So would it make sense for us as well, I guess, for a deliverable for that third option, have a good feel for, or substantial progress and a good feel for how much space do we actually need? What's everybody's thoughts?
Hey, Adam.
Yeah.
There's a private building within 20 feet of Trade and Transit 1 and 2 that's very interested in selling or renting. Just putting that out there.
There you go.
Some of you guys already know this. I've already actually spoke to a couple of you guys about it, but just I'm letting you guys know there's one within 20 feet.
Sir, I think we need to decide what we want in the building. And that's the very first decision. Before we even go any further on a public safety building, the question is, do you want your police department in City Hall at all? That's a decision between obviously the mayor and city council. The minute you make that decision, then we will have our marching orders and we will know exactly what square footage we need and or something close to what we need and what we need to be looking for in terms of building options. But that initial decision on whether you want police with you still or not has to be made. Otherwise, we're going to do, or we potentially would be doing a lot of work on a public safety building for no reason if you still want us in the building. Understanding that we need to keep it as an option, but I just thought I'd mention that.
No, I appreciate that, and a very good point. I don't know how we really answer that without doing some initial work either. So maybe we leave it as we are for the next meeting. And if we think of anything in between now and then, we can offline chat about it and start to dig into it. So
I think to a large extent, the question of public safety building within or without City Hall and what branches of public safety we would look at moving out of City Hall versus keeping in City Hall
yeah,
is not as much a financial choice as it is, and as Chief Hagan points out, a matter of a powwow between the administration and council in terms of what the feeling is. And the reason I say that is it's, I mean, if we're electing to stay in City Hall, then obviously we have space carved out for at least a portion of our public safety services in City Hall already. If we're electing to move, then that changes the, you know, the decision. But that conversation about if we decide to move, are we looking to move to separate public safety is a whole other huge question, and we've discussed it a couple of times. Part of the question there, though, is if public safety is looking for a fresh built building, once again, that's something more like a 5 to 10 year timeline.
Yeah.
We're looking to change locations for City Hall within that timeline, then we have to find a place for public safety in the meantime. And that for the police in the meantime. And that, yeah, there are just an awful lot of moving parts here, guys. Sorry.
no, it's okay.
Yeah,
It's all good.
but
Yeah.
but the one thing that I think is to a certain extent discretionary rather than dictated by our findings is the question of whether the police department travels with the remaining departments within City Hall or goes off on its own. Then we could potentially split the police department out even if we were remaining in the City Hall building and try to utilize that space for something else or some sort of nonprofit partnership with the city or something like that. So
Okay.
even staying in City Hall does not necessarily make the police department remaining a necessity.
Yeah.
But I do think I think that's a bit more a matter of not quite aesthetics, but it is a little more a discretionary choice than a lot of the other decisions that have to be made on a financial basis. The one other point that I'd raised as we're moving forward with this process is I think that we need to actively consider both the fiscal elements of the fiscal and the timeliness elements of moving City Hall. That is to say, is it more financially advantageous for us to move, and how long would the process take, depending on what approach we're looking at. But the other thing is that the appearance of a city's government building affects the perception of that city as well. So we need to be thinking, that is to say, I would personally be strongly opposed to us moving into a warehouse somewhere in an industrial sector of the city. I think everyone would feel that way, but I'm just saying, I'm just putting that out there that,
Yeah.
that there are clearly things that are that are financially the most feasible.
Yeah.
You know, that would not be a move that one would make with the seat of city government. And so part of what we need to consider is what we think is what look we want for our city and the way in which city government represents that. But
No, understood. I think as we initially dive into this and start to figure this out, I think that's something that we need to keep at the forefront of our heads, for sure. So, maybe as another, I guess, third or deliverable here, you know, maybe between the members of council that are here and the mayor, maybe we work to start and or make progress in that conversation as far as making a decision on what we deem would be the most appropriate if we would move out of City Hall, regardless of where we move to. So I'm not sure what medium we do that with, what have you, but I mean, Mayor Slaughter, I think council will be certainly happy to have that conversation with you and vice versa. I think in efforts of just, you know, before we run too far, make sure that we're on the same page as far as, I guess, answering that question. What do you think?
Yeah, agreed. We can have those discussions with, yeah, obviously between
Yeah.
administration and council.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's perfect. Okay. So I think at least for the next few weeks here, we've got some work ahead of us from an investigatory perspective. Before we adjourn, any related items from the committee, members of the administration and council? All right. So I to be safe, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn because as it's an ad hoc committee, we got to run it in line with how we run our council or our council committee meetings. So I'll take a motion to adjourn if there's nothing else from anybody.
So moved.
second,
All in favor?
aye.
Aye.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll be chatting. Looking forward to working with everybody and looking forward to doing it right the last time.
All right.
Thanks,
Hopefully
everyone.
Thanks, Adam.
Yep. Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night, guys.
Guys.
Yep.
Bye.
Stay safe.